And finally tonight, the California coast is renowned for its beauty, but much of that may have been lost if it weren't for a group of dedicated citizens whose stories are told in the new documentary, Rebels with a Cause. We'll hear from the filmmakers Nancy Kelly and Kenji Yamamoto after this clip.
How did they do it? Between the 1950s and the 1970s, when California was the nation's fastest growing state and cities were gobbling up nearby forests and fields, ordinary people in the San Francisco Bay Area saved a vast stretch of coastline north of the Golden Gate Bridge for parks and farms. Their efforts fostered a national movement to preserve open spaces near where people live.
Nancy Kelly and Kenji Yamamoto, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us.
Now, your film focuses on normal, everyday citizens who led the drive to preserve open space back in the 1950s. What was California like then, and what were attitudes like?
Well, it was the post-war era. California was the fastest growing state in the nation, and the prevailing attitudes were growth is good. Just develop everything, and especially land along the coast was being developed.
Because the views were so spectacular.
Right.
Developers wanted that.
And the National Park Service was watching that happen, knowing that some of these lands had been had their eye on them for a long time and seeing them covered with development.
So how did the volunteers come into play in all this? Who were they, and what drew them to the cause?
Well, they were ordinary people, and some of them were transplants from other parts of the country, and they saw what happened in their own neighborhood. Clem Miller, a congressman who brought up the Point Reyes bill to President Kennedy, he was from Wilmington, and he saw what happened to his city, that all of the open spaces were being gobbled up by corporations, and so he really got upset. He didn't want this to happen where he was living now in Corte Madera.
And in fact, we have a clip that mentions Clem Miller and his efforts to help preserve what is now Point Reyes National Seashore. Let's take a look.
The original cost of acquiring the Point Reyes land was $14 million. That $14 million was a lot of money in the 1960s. And Clem Miller came to me and said, "We've got a big problem out of Point Reyes."
The big problem was that acquiring the ranches for the park had pushed the anticipated cost of the National Seashore from $14 million to $25 million and counting, and Congress was balking. So the Park Service developed an unusual plan. The ranches would be in the park, yet would stay in private hands as long as farming continued.
You know, we now take urban parks sort of for granted, but it was really unusual at the time in the 1950s to have parks and open space near where people lived. Why was that so important to all these volunteers?
Well, it was, I mean, the population was just booming during that time, and there were literally not enough campgrounds and parks that people could get to without having to take a week or 2 weeks vacation to go to Yosemite or Yellowstone.
They just wanted something in their own backyard that they could take their families to and enjoy a weekend or a day at.
Right, right. They did, and even the National Park Service didn't want anything to do with the idea of national parks. But you know, this was in the Bay Area. This was the beginning of that movement.
That's pretty astounding to think that the National Park Service itself did not want urban parks.
Well, they thought of the perfect national park as being in wilderness, like in the Rockies or in Alaska, places that were wild. And I think what was really particular about the Bay Area is that after World War II, there were many infantrymen, people from the armed forces, the Navy, who built ships here and didn't want to leave. They loved where they were living, and that certainly was a great benefit for them and their families when they discovered the open spaces, the beaches, such as that.
So that kind of led to this continual clash, if you will, between do we preserve it or do we develop it because so many people need housing. And even Marin County supervisors at that time weren't on board. They fought against preserving Point Reyes. Is that right?
They fought against preserving Point Reyes. They fought for building a city of 30,000 in the Marin Headlands. They were totally pro-development at that time.
You also talk in the film about a proposed development in the Bolinas Lagoon and the Marin Cello development north of the Golden Gate. What would these areas look like today had these normal everyday citizens, rebels with a cause as you call them, not stepped in and successfully stopped the developments? Kenji?
Well, you know, the prevailing thought at the time was that having a complete community with everything in it, all your recreation, your work, your job, and your churches all in one spot. That was the idea, and the idea also that the tax base would rise by having all the community, all the people sort of concentrated in one spot. It would have been Marin Cello would have been a city of 20 or 30,000 people 10 minutes from San Francisco.
With a high rise on the top of every knob, on every hill, and Bolinas Lagoon was supposed to have a heliport and a big marina and boatels and motels, and it was going to be great.
And to accommodate that, they were going to build a 4-lane freeway through Marin County to Bolinas, and so that it was really going to be.
It would have been vastly different
Very
from what we have now.
different.
What do you think is the biggest lesson here? One of the best quotes, I think, comes toward the end of the film when one of your so-called rebels says, "Nobody remembers you or remembers the struggle. They just know it's there." What's the best lesson?
You know, it takes ordinary people. It takes a single voice, really, to say, this is what we want to save. It takes that kind of passion, and with one voice you get many voices, and so you don't feel like you're alone once other people share your interest. That's what it really means.
And it's a powerful lesson because it was everyday citizens who made this happen, not lawmakers, not legislators, not the Park Service.
Right.
Well, Nancy and Kenji, thanks so much for joining us. It's been a pleasure to have you on and learn more about your film.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks.
And Rebels with a Cause is currently playing in select Bay Area theaters. You can find a link to the site at kqed.org/thisweek.